Actually, my country's poor because Europe stole our resources.
Yeah, well, you actually own them now, don't you? Colonialism occurred largely before the advent of electricity.
The problem with ignorant arguments is they're so incredibly easy to make. The only thing required of you is ignorance, and yet unpacking and refuting those arguments usually takes information and evidence and effort. This is why ignorance is so prevalent in mainstream discourse, because people are lazy. Now, the notion that former colonies have had complete sovereignty and total control of their own resources and economies since colonialism officially ended is a lie. Partially because when Western countries did decolonize, they demonstrably, deliberately did it in a way that purposely destabilized the regions they were leaving former colonies in a disadvantageous position when it came to engaging in trade and creating chaos that would hamstring and inhibit them from investing in and growing their own infrastructure, preventing them from ever becoming competition. One example of this would be the British partition of India and Pakistan. See, when the British left in 1947, which is significantly later than the advent of electricity, but moving on, they divided the region into separate sovereign entities and divided the people into separate nationalities, which simply put was one for the Muslims and one for the Hindus, citing that the religious differences and the hostility between the groups were too great and leaving India as a single entity would make India ungovernable and lead to further destabilization. Now, this may sound somewhat reasonable until we add the context that the British Empire employed what they themselves described as a divide and rule strategy. What does it say? Fostering tensions between different religious and social groups to maintain their control. So essentially, a big reason there were such irreconcilable differences is because the British worked really hard to put them there. And dividing them into separate states under overtly hostile leadership would create neighboring countries forever in conflict with each other. Considering that these countries were in open conflict with each other just a few months ago is evidence of how effective that was. Now, another good example of this divide and rule strategy was what the Belgian government did to the people of Rwanda, dividing them into arbitrary, non-existent ethnic groups and giving preferential treatment to one over the other, sowing discord and hatred within the population they were trying to control, which eventually led to one of the most famous massacres in modern history. Another slightly more subtle example of the West maintaining power over former colonies comes in the form of the CFA franc, which is a currency that France installed in their former colonies and then tied the value to their own currency at a rate of 2-to-1, allowing them to always trade from a position of strength. This situation still exists today, and this currency is currently tied to the euro because that's what France uses now. Now, France have used this situation to give themselves board seats and ensure themselves functional veto power over these countries' central banks. Essentially, if these countries want to engage in economic reform in a way that France decides is bad for the French economy, the French can just veto it. The French can prohibit them from engaging in basic economic regulation, quantitative easing, devaluation, issuing loans or currency. The things a country needs to do to stabilize or strengthen their economy and put themselves in a good position to trade or develop infrastructure. And also, up until 2020, these countries were required to deposit 50% of their own foreign exchange reserve in the French treasury, which they also had to pay France interest to do. So essentially, they were paying the French money to store their money, allowing the French to invest that money on behalf of the French. Now, the question becomes, why did these countries that obviously have total freedom and autonomy allow the French to maintain this system if it was so bad for them? And I'm glad you asked. The answer is, of course, violence. The French have interfered militarily in the region over 40 times since the 1960s, which is again significantly later than the advent of electricity. Speaking of violence, that's what tends to happen to leaders in developing countries that try to run their countries policies in a way that doesn't serve Western interests. It happened to Patrice Lumumba when he asked the Soviet Union to help him remove Belgian colonial soldiers who were illegally refusing to leave the Congo. This resulted in a CIA campaign to topple his government and fund insurrection, which eventually led to his extremely violent death, which eventually led to the installation of a dictator who was more friendly to Western interests. Another America-friendly dictator was installed and supported in Indonesia, which claimed the lives of over 1 million innocent people, a genocide that the American government at the time denied was even happening and claimed was just Russian propaganda. When the Guatemalan government tried to tax wealthy landowners, they ended up getting violently overthrown because the wealthiest landowner at the time was an American corporation, which led to yet another dictator and yet another genocide. Now, examples like this could go on for hours and hours and hours. There's a horribly deep and violent well to draw from here. And as stated in the beginning, it's much easier to simply dismiss centuries worth of systematic violence and oppression than it is to actually try to understand it.